prostitute, nor was I ever. Thank you for that. Appreciate that vote of confidence. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit today about trafficking. Can everyone hear me? Okay, just pulling my clothes down, so sorry. We're going to talk a little bit today about trafficking, what it is, but mainly what I want to do today is arm you with some information because this hospital especially, you're on our list at our place as frontliners. We call you frontliners. Does anyone know why? No one knows why this hospital in particular, when it comes to trafficking, would be considered a frontliner. Think about an army, people who go out in the front, they encounter the most what? Things, right? You send the people out in the front, they're the ones that get. You guys are on the front of receiving in a lot of these cases, okay? So at our agency, what we do in our community is we look at where in the community are there frontliners, okay? Meaning people who are kind of intersecting victims of trafficking just by the nature of what they do for a living. Does that make sense? Some other frontliners are like hotel people, people in the hospitality industry, people who run truck stops, okay? People who are existing in some of the most high-risk areas or a place like University Health that kind of has the influx of people from a lot of the risk factors that deal with trafficking. That make sense? Everybody got it? So I've been training at this hospital for a while for that reason, because anytime I can arm frontliners with, one, information on how to know if it's happening or not, but then more importantly, what to do, because that's the most important part, right? Like if you see something and you know something's wrong, but you don't know what to do about it, you're kind of paralyzed, right? And there's a lot, especially when it comes to trafficking, there's a lot of misconceptions about what you can and can't do to address it. So I really want you to leave with kind of feeling armed and dangerous, right? When it comes to trafficking, that if it ever presented in front of you, that you would know what to do and you would pass the ball to the next person and you could go to sleep that night knowing that you did your part in fighting trafficking. Isn't that something really cool that you can learn right here on your lunch break? So, is this a lunch break? Yes. Okay. All right. So, just a little bit to kind of paint a picture of why this training is important in this facility. One of the first trainings I ever did here was, I guess, beginning of last year, was with case management. And I guess that was last year. It was in the shift between LSU and University Health, and everything was kind of crazy, and they brought me in, and we did our first training, and it was a room full of people who honestly were like staring back at me like, you are crazy, you have lost your mind, this doesn't happen here, I don't want to hear it, okay? It was one of those environments. It was one of those first times that everyone was having to kind of deal with the fact that this was a real thing, right? So I did this training, and honestly, I got in my car and I was like, oh, I just don't think that went well at all. Like, there were no questions, there was no like, can I talk to you after? Nothing. And so fast forward a few weeks, and I get a phone call from someone in case management. And she's like, hey, like she's kind of like, I can hear she's kind of nervous. She's like, I think there's one here, right? Like there was this, like she was like, I don't know what to say, but I think there's someone here in the ER. And I said, okay. I was like, what makes you think that? So she's kind of explaining the situation. And we just happened to, that day, have a girl that had been living in one of our homes. We house women who are victims of trafficking to get them out and give them a year to a year and a half of recovery. One of those women had disappeared, and from what we could gather, had been found by her pimp and we were not able to reach her that particular week. And so as she's explaining this patient, it's clicking in my mind. Like, I'm like, that's her. Like, I'm listening to, she didn't tell me her name, obviously, which is the worst part about the hospital, because I'm like, just tell me your name. Okay, but she's explaining the situation, what the guy looks like, what the girl kind of looks like, kind of what she's presenting as, her attitude, which was, women, we know attitude, you can identify an attitude. I was like, that sounds like my girl. So I said to her, I was like, okay, were you at the training? She said, yeah. I said, okay, so you know what to do, right? She was like, yes. And so, very long story short, what we were able to do that day was nothing short of a miracle. So what ended up happening, the pimp was present in the room, and because that woman paid attention in that training, right, and she had actually gone to the nurses, I don't know how I told her my limited knowledge is Grey's Anatomy of the medical world, so the unit that she was in, and kind of said, hey, this is what to look for if it ever happens, this is what we do. So she had already done that on her own, which was really amazing. That day, we were able, basically what happened is I said, I'm on my way, but I cannot come in that room with him there, right? Because I got to continue to do this, right? So if I am identified by a pimp, my career's over, maybe my life. No, I'm just kidding. And so I said, well, we got to do this in a way where I can get alone with her just to talk to her, but I think we can do it. So I drove down here and they brought me in the back. And by the time that I got there, that case manager and the nurse at the time had developed a plan. Now, the phone call was a nervous Nelly, that's what we call them. When I got there, they were ready, man. They were like, here's what we're gonna do. And they were acting like cops. I was like, man, they were so fired up. So basically the plan they had come up with was we are going to take her to x-ray. She didn't need an x-ray, but we're gonna take her to x-ray, which means that he can't come, right? He can't come into that room, and you're going to be in the room, the x-ray room. We don't need to take an x-ray, but that will buy us about 20 minutes, or however long an x-ray would take. So they put me into this x-ray room. The guy was so confident and so bold, and this is how a lot of pimps are, that he walked right up to the door of that x-ray room. I could hear it. I'm standing on the other side. They open the door, they wheel her in, they close the door, and I step out, and she's like, it's the girl, okay? And she registers, it's over, I can leave, right? Because this guy had been beating her senseless, hadn't been feeding her, she had been bound up, all of these things that you think only exist on the movies. And then what this hospital did from there was they blocked off all the hallways that it would take for me to get out the back entrance, okay? I'm not joking, this really happened. We ran her out of this hospital through the trash exit, trash entrance where they go to pick up the trash, and then University Health Police escorted us to the interstate. And guess where her pimp was? Waiting in the room. So the nurse goes back up, this nurse, just like you, goes back up and says, we don't know where she went. She went out for a smoke and never came back. And she got out forever. She's still out. I mean, isn't that insane? All of that came because one person in one training listened and remembered and made one phone call. Okay, now she went way above and beyond. I mean, I'm telling you, I literally was like, they're the greatest heroes in my career, those two individuals who stepped forward, and they were hilarious. It wasn't funny at the time, but everyone was real worked up like we were on a movie, because it kind of felt like we were. But all that to say is that life was rescued because someone in your position knew what to do. Is that important? Isn't that the coolest thing? That training actually does make a difference. And so that after that first training, I was like, regardless of whether people want to hear it or not, there's going to be one person in the room who may get it, and that one person may be the person that actually saves someone's life. And so today what I want is for all of you to hear this stuff, because it's important. It's important to know that in our city it's happening, that women and children are coming through this hospital who are victims of sex trafficking. And because that's true, we need to be armed and knowledgeable about what's going on. Because the thing is, a woman or a child is only going to try to report one time usually. And if they report one time and no one does anything, what does that tell them? It's not important, it's not credible. What'd you say? There's no point. Because the risk that they put themselves in to report or to say anything, they put their literal lives on the line. And so when we train people, what we say is no pressure, right? But if that happens and that presents in front of you, you need to move on their behalf to show them that it matters, it's credible, their life is important, and that there is a way out. Because no matter how bad the situation is when it comes to trafficking, no matter how bad it presents, there's always a way out. Okay, there's always a way out. Unless we wait too long, and then sometimes we don't have a choice to do that. All right, so you guys ready? Sorry, that was a little heavy. Little introduction. Okay. So everyone knows what sex trafficking is, correct? Someone tell me. What do you think it is? There's no wrong, well, there are wrong answers, but I'm not going to shame you. Okay, prostitution. Specifically what, though? All prostitution? No, forced prostitution, okay? Yeah, so basically the definition of trafficking for an adult is any time an adult is used bought, sold, traded for sex with no consent. Their consent has been taken from them. Because there is the reality of women working in prostitution of their own choice. Okay, that is not considered trafficking. The best way in the U.S. to kind of paint a picture of trafficking is anytime a pimp is involved, because very typically if a pimp is involved, their consent has been removed in some form. Okay, maybe they chose it at the beginning and they became prostitutes because of whatever, but at this point in their life with their pimp, they have no choice but to do a list of things. Okay, that would be considered trafficking. For a child, though, it's very cut and dry. Anytime a child is involved or engaged in prostitution at any age under 18, they are a victim of trafficking. Now, a lot of times people separate victims of trafficking from child prostitutes. Okay, there is no difference. There's no such thing as a child prostitute as far as it being different from a victim of trafficking. It doesn't matter if it's happened to them one time or over and over again. If they're under 18, they have been victimized by sex trafficking, and anyone involved in that victimization, okay, whether it's a parent, because that happens a lot, a family member, or a pimp, no matter who it is, they can actually federally be charged with human trafficking, no matter what. So why that's important is because, especially when it comes to children, they're not going to, and this is the best piece of advice I could give you, is nobody who's involved in trafficking, no victim, is going to come to you and say, I'm being trafficked. They don't know that. They don't, most of the time, especially teenagers and children, not only do they not know what the word trafficked means, they don't know really what prostitution is. They don't really know what a pimp is. And so they're not necessarily going to come to you, and it's not going to be that black and white where they're like, I'm a prostitute and I need help. Most of the time, adults know, but most of the time children, it's become so much a part of their life and their culture that for them, nothing is registering as negative necessarily, okay? In Shreveport, most of what we see with child trafficking or teenage trafficking is out of the home, what we call homegrown, a child that's been brought up in an environment of drug use, drug abuse, drug dealing, and prostitution inside the home by other adults, is then put into prostitution as a way of making money for that household, okay? Whether it's to pay the bills or to fund the drug habits that are present. That's the number one version of teenage, especially teenage trafficking in our city. A lot of times when you track back their story, that's where it started for them. They were taught that in their home, and because they were taught that in their home, they don't identify it as anything different than the culture they were brought up in. Okay, they may end up under a pimp, but at the beginning, most of the girls that we encounter were taught that as a part of their culture. Okay, so everybody got that? Anybody have any questions about that? All right, okay, so those are the federal definitions of trafficking. So for an adult, it's any time their consent is taken through force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, this is all in your packet. For a child, does it matter if any of those things are present? No, because here's the reality. Most of the time when we encounter a teenager, either when I come here on a referral or we meet her, wherever we meet her, and we identify that she's been trafficked and has a pimp, and we look at her and say, do you want out? What do you think the number one answer they say is? No. And why it's important to know that regardless of what they're saying, regardless of whether they enjoy it, because most of the time they say they enjoy it, regardless of how protected they are over that pimp, none of that matters, because this is what happens sometimes. Well, she said she wanted to do it. So, I mean, what can we do, right? For a child, it doesn't matter. Whether they say they want to do it or they enjoy it or whatever, it doesn't matter. We still move on behalf of them as if they're a victim because they are. And the cool part about the law, the federal law that's been passed over the last 10 years, is federally and by the law, they cannot be prosecuted as a criminal. And so what's good about that is that when we encounter a teenager that is experiencing trafficking at the hands of anyone, we can say to them, you cannot be in trouble for what you're doing. They have to be treated as a victim. Now, they can get in trouble for other things, like if they're using drugs and if they're running away and things like that. But when it comes to that specific part of their life with prostitution, they cannot be charged with it. And so that's a great thing that's happened over the last 5 to 10 years that gives us the ability to move on behalf of them as victims and not criminals. All right, so that's a little bit about the definition. We're not going to really talk a whole lot about how people get into that situation, okay? There's 1,000 different ways and a million different stories that you hear when it comes to how children or women end up as victims of trafficking. I will tell you a few of the most at-risk populations because I think that's important for you to know. All of this is in your packet, plus some. I'm not going to go line by line through this, so I would suggest you go home or on your free time if you have any. I don't know, med school, she's like, no, we don't have free time. So just whatever. Have someone read it to you when you're sleeping. I don't know how you need to do that, but read it because it's got some really good information. But I want to kind of go over some of the higher risk populations of people because that's our number one piece of information we need to know, okay? Because if you can identify a high risk population or a high risk situation, you've already taken a step towards recognizing a victim, okay? So let's go over those really quickly. The first one is extreme poverty or generational poverty. In Louisiana specifically, because that's where we work and that's what's important. For us here, poverty, extreme poverty and generational poverty is pretty much 100% of the time the background noise in a lot of these cases, okay? Very rarely do you see a victim of trafficking that isn't coming out of poverty, all right? And the reason for that is because poverty puts you in a situation called survival mode. Okay? If you don't have what you need, then you're placed into a way of living that the only reason you wake up and go to sleep every day is to get to the next day, to survive. We can't identify with that, right? Because we enjoy life, right? Have you ever thought about that? We don't survive. I mean, you may feel like you're just barely surviving right now, okay? But there's a part of our life where we look forward to our meals and what we're going to eat and what TV shows are we enjoy life. We cannot identify, for the most part, with survival mode. What survival mode does is it pushes you into the world is your kind of open option. There's all these options. Survival mode takes it down to very few, especially if you have children, right? Because you have these precious little ones looking at you, and there's no way around the fact that you have to eat. You have to have somewhere to stay, and all of the essentials of life, it's not like we can be like, no, I'm good, I don't need that. We need it, right? And so survival mode in poverty puts a woman into a position where I'm not really thinking about what's the best option for me. I'm really thinking about if that option provides this, then it's a no-brainer yes for me. Does that make sense? That's why the judgment of women in prostitution is so awfully placed sometimes, right? Because what I always train about, and this is a whole other training about women in prostitution, is none of them in my entire career, if you can call it that, I wasn't a prostitute, I'm not referring to mine. My career in helping them, none of them have I ever met one person who said to me, this is what I wanted to do with my life. This is what I chose to do. I mean, maybe they chose it, but it's not like they woke up one day and they were like, yeah, that sounds like the career path I want to choose. Okay, none of them. Survival is most of the time the common denominator in their life. They did what they had to do to get to the next day. And when it comes to a pimp, that's the number one thing they are looking for, is a woman with massive vulnerabilities that they can do what? They can meet. They can fill it. Take advantage of it by providing. Okay, so if you ever wonder if a woman comes into the ER and feels and it feels like she's in love and very loyal to that pimp, do you see now maybe why she is? Why? What's he probably doing? Taking care of her, which is very hard to say, right? But the reality is, most of the time these pimps are actually physically taking care of these girls. Okay, a lot of times people think all a pimp is a violent person who just does all of these terrible things, but in reality, they're doing those terrible things, but those terrible things are masked by the fact that they're really actually taking care of the girls in ways that those girls have never been taken care of. And that's why you find them to be so loyal. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry, I'm like blazing through this. Foster care system and runaways. The number one population that's targeted by pimps or traffickers or recruiters, the number one place is foster care. Anyone want to take a stab at why? They don't have anybody to support them. That's exactly right. That's one of the biggest things. When a child's in foster care, they've experienced a massive loss of their family of origin. They do not feel that they have a place to belong. Right? That maybe they're in a home and they're taken care of, and a lot of us in middle class America are like, that's amazing, you have a foster mom. Okay, it is amazing. I'm an adoptive mom, but the reality is it's a replacement. right? It's not the answer. The answer is their family of origin. And so what happens is a child usually goes into foster care because of some very strong trauma that's happened in their life. They've been removed from their parent for whatever reason, abuse, drug abuse, whatever. They've run away from home. And so you're already dealing with an at-risk population anyways because they've run away from home or been abused. And now they're disconnected from their family of origin so they don't feel that they belong where they are. And the sex industry becomes a place where anyone belongs. That pimp or that individual is going to paint a picture of a family that that child can now be a part of. Just yesterday, I was talking to a girl, and she is a victim of trafficking. She's come into our program, and I just asked her. I said, "What is the main reason why you stayed? All these years, what is the main reason why you stayed?" And you know what she said to me? She said, "Because I had a family. It didn't matter what he did to me. I was already abused as a child at home. So he was abusing me, but it wasn't that much different. But at the end of the day, he cooked us dinner and we all sat at the table." Okay? So here you have this man who's buying, selling, and trading multiple human beings, right? That's what he's doing. That's why they're there. All of that goes out the window every evening when he sets the table and they have a family environment. Do you see? Foster care and runaways are the number, especially runaways. A child that runs away from home will be given the chance to be in the sex industry within the first 48 hours. That's a U.S. statistic that they came out with a few years ago. Basically what that means is within 48 hours of a child running away from home, someone has crossed their path with that offer. Now, they're not walking up to them like, "Hey, do you want to be a prostitute?" Okay, that's not what that means. It means that a pimp or a recruiter or someone that is connected to the industry of prostitution has made an encounter or an interaction with her within the first 48 hours. What we find is that in Shreveport, it is much faster. Typically, it is, like, just to paint a picture, we had a girl in a program, she ran away, she was 15, she ran away from our program. One day she was sitting in our art room doing a project. One of us went to the bathroom, came back out, and she was gone. She had been with us for like 6 months. So we went into an all-out search party, right? And within 12 hours, there was a picture posted of her on Facebook by a pimp within 12 hours. Now, this child has been separated from that life for 6 months. Within 12 hours, she had been posted on Facebook being called this pimp's wifey, which basically means that she had already been elevated to a status within 12 hours. That is how quickly it happened. She ran out the doors of our place, ran out, got a ride right down the street, and immediately was back into the game of prostitution, surprisingly with a completely different pimp. Isn't that the crazy? I'm not making this up. This is actually happening in our city. So those populations of kids, that a lot of them come into this hospital. We've had multiple referrals come out of this hospital. The first thing I ever did when it was LSU was a 16-year-old victim of trafficking who came in, and it was before any of us knew what we were doing. Nobody knew. I didn't even know what I was doing. I was like, fake it till you make it. Like, I showed up and I was like, "Yes, I'm the trafficking liaison." I don't know what I'm going to say. And what ended up happening is she walked out the front door of this hospital and no one knew where she went. We never heard from her again. And so after that is when everyone was like, "Okay, we've got to do something." So it's happening and it's coming through the doors of this hospital. And the last two high risk are obvious ones: highly sexualized behavior and drug users. Okay, a girl who is already highly sexual is going to be way more at risk than a child who isn't, because that risky behavior doesn't scare a child who's used to being sexually active. So when it comes down to someone who comes into their life and provides for them and then says, "Hey, will you start having sex with some people for money?" If they're already highly sexual, it's a way easier sell, right, than to a child who's never even been introduced to that. Okay, so that makes them high risk. I'm sorry, this is really strong. Let me dial it back a little bit. And drug users, obviously. When a child or an adult is addicted to a drug, that drug in essence first becomes their pimp. Okay, and we have girls tell us that all the time. The worst pimp they ever had was survival. The second worst pimp they ever had was drugs. Okay, because you can't escape that, right? You can't escape those two things. But a lot of times what happens with a pimp is the first step in that girl's life is they get them hooked to a drug if they're not already hooked. Why do you think that is? Control. If I can get you addicted to something that I become the only place you can get it, then are you going to leave me? More than likely not. Okay, we see that on a regular basis. We had just this week a woman here. She was released yesterday. She's been in this hospital for 2 weeks. Who has been working under a pimp. This is a little strong as well. Everything I do is strong, sorry. Been working under a pimp with an active HIV virus that has kind of gone into full-blown AIDS. Okay, just a terrible situation. And the reality is that she, when we found her a few weeks ago, had been so hooked on meth by this guy that she was going to lay there in that motel room and die of AIDS before she reached out to get treatment. Why? Yeah, because she knew the minute she called us, she wasn't getting that drug. Not anymore. Not while she's in our care, right? So we encountered her. She, just to tell you the bad shape she was in, she had 4 blood transfusions while in this hospital. She had probably lost about 75 pounds. When we picked her up, she was literally a skeleton. She can't walk, she couldn't swallow, she couldn't talk. I mean, so you have this reality of this woman who is literally laying in a motel room just dying. Because if I reach out for help and go to a hospital or go to Purchase, which is the name of our place, I will lose access not only to him, but more importantly, to that drug. Okay, so drug users are high risk population. So any questions before we move? Yeah. Right. It does happen to males, but at least in our city, it's obviously more prominently seen in women. The thing about male prostitution and victims of trafficking that are male is, you know, you have this stigma for women in prostitution, but the stigma for men in prostitution is so much greater that it drives it underground a lot. So it is literally like you have to be looking for it to encounter it. If that makes any sense. Like you have to know where to go to get it, because the shame and the stigma is so strong when it comes to men. For women in our city, if you drive to we call the right part of town, but the wrong part of town, you'll encounter it just walking. It's not like that for males. And so the statistics are way higher for women, mainly because women report a lot easier too because of that shame. So that's a great question. We work primarily with women. We have worked with guys before, but it's primarily women. So, all right, let's move into some of the medical signs and symptoms of trafficking. So basically, how is it going to present in your sphere? Okay, because a lot of the things I'm about to tell you, I wouldn't be privy to because I'm not in the medical world, right? And also, just being real super vulnerable, I have no idea what some of this means. So I'm telling you, Grey's Anatomy, that's all I've got. So, and I'm obsessed with it, so I'm kind of an expert at Grey's Anatomy, but that doesn't make me an expert at medical things, right? Okay, so we're going to go over, not all of these, I'm going to go over the most prominent ones and kind of explain why they would be presenting and then what you can do after that, all right? Okay, one little kind of disclosure before. One of these symptoms or red flags showing up does not mean that person's being trafficked, okay? My husband always tells me, don't find a trafficker in every bush, okay? Like, we were at a restaurant a few weeks ago, and I grabbed his arm. There was an older gentleman walking in with a very, very, very young foreign girl. She wasn't a child, but female. And instead of just thinking maybe they were on a date, I grabbed my husband's arms. I was like, something's wrong. And he was like, no, we're at Chili's. I don't think they're just going to traipse around here if that's what's happening. Okay, so we got to dial back the drama a little bit. So if one of these things is presenting in a person, not necessarily, that doesn't always mean trafficking, even 2 or 3 things, okay, doesn't always mean that. But if you are finding 4 or 5, especially some of these specific ones, what this does, it at least puts you in a position to be like, I need to be paying attention, right, to this situation and looking at it through the eyes of what could potentially be happening. Okay, so not one of these is not a trafficking victim. So, appears malnourished and dehydrated, that's one right there. How often do you guys see that? Okay, that doesn't mean that they're being trafficked. Multiple injuries, signs of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse or neglect. That right there is a reason to do something, period. Like if someone has signs of being physically abused, I mean, you guys know that you're supposed to move no matter what. But often victims of trafficking, the way that we identify them a lot of time is that what type of abuse they seem to be under, or what visible things we can see. Like, for example, you guys think I'm lying, but I'm here all the time. I'm here all the time. You just don't ever see me. A few months ago, a girl came in. She was found walking nude on Cladfant Parkway. A little weird. Little radar went off, right? And they're like, we don't know. We should probably call Cassie because she was walking nude on Cladfant Parkway. So, but when I arrived, the first thing that I saw was bruising around her wrists and bruising around her ankles. What did that tell me? Yeah, she had a foot drop. What did that tell me? Her feet, right? Her arms and feet had to have been bound, all right? So bruises, markings, all of those things are important, okay? They're very important to know, like, what's the difference between a black eye and that? I mean, that is the reason they called us, were the markings on their wrists. So see, this training is actually quite useful. And that's an abnormal kind of abuse, right? And it's reason for you to pay attention. All right, multiple STDs, STIs, or pregnancies, especially in children, okay? Most women and teenagers that come into our program bring with them a lot of STD baggage, okay? We're talking 4, 5, 6 at a time. And so that's a red flag, especially if a child under the age of 18 has multiple STDs at one time, right? Or they're coming in frequently with STDs, because that's just the lifestyle of prostitution. Okay, it comes with the job. That's number one part of the job, is that you're constantly sick. Okay, overdose, multiple overdoses on drugs or alcohol, like yeast infections. That stuff is gross. Sorry, I know that's your line of work. But we're talking about multiple cases of this, especially in a child. Lack of knowledge about where they are. Okay, that sounds like that would never happen, but it's very, very common. Many times at this hospital I've arrived and the individual doesn't even know what city they're in or what state. We had a girl who thought she was in Michigan, okay, because that's where she was originally recruited, and because they keep them drugged so much and move them around so much, she thought she was just outside of the city that she was originally recruited from, and not in fact in Louisiana. So imagine how shocking that was. So lack of knowledge about whereabouts, where they are, what hospital, how did I get here, all that kind of stuff. Also, that probably happens in other scenarios too, but that happens a lot when it comes to victims of trafficking. Lack of proper identification. Mainly the way that this presents is that there's a third-party person who has all of that stuff. Okay, pimps keep everything. They keep their phones, their ID. If they have a passport, normally they don't. Birth certificate, whatever piece of information identifies them as a person, typically is kept by either the recruiter or the pimp. Why do you think that is? Can you do anything important without those things? No. You can't book a hotel room. You can't book a flight. You can't do many things when all of your identification has been taken from you. And so either they can't or don't have it, especially if they're foreign. Okay, we have situations of foreigners being brought in for a job and their job actually being trafficked out of our casinos here. So if they're here and they're foreign and they don't have identification, you need to call someone. Okay, that's one of these. If that's the only thing going on, you need to let someone know. Okay, because that's very, very, very bad sign. So lack of proper ID or not in control of it. Okay, and what not in control means, especially an adult, if there's someone else present, just like with that girl that I came that day, that she has to ask for everything. Okay, that's not normal in an adult. Okay, with a child it's a little different because the parent is supposed to have all that stuff. But for an adult, if she's having to constantly ask questions of a third party that's present, that is a very strong sign that there's something going on there, that third party is in control of that person's life. Refusal to speak or cannot speak. Cannot meaning submissive. Anyone ever seen someone submissive, like to the point where they can't speak because they've been trained to not speak? That is the every day of my life. That's what we deal with. We deal with women who want to, you can tell, because you know when someone wants to say something, but cannot speak. Okay. The reason for that is when especially in big cases of trafficking where it's kind of a more organized crime, there's a brainwashing that has happened for those individuals who are a part of it, where this fear they live in a sense of fear, and it's, if you ever say anything, if you ever report, we'll kill you, or we'll kill your son, or we'll kill your mother. Okay, very, very common threats. And so a lot of times when we go into a room or into a hotel and immediately can tell that girl is submissive to that point, we know that there's a way around that they're not going to tell you. They're not going to tell you anything in that scenario. But fearful submission is different than I just don't want to talk. Okay, we deal with both. Okay, you know the difference between, right? That's not fearful submission. That's like, I'm just not telling you because I don't have to, right? My daughter does that, so she's 4. All right. Inconsistent story, claim of just visiting, meaning you ask, because you ask questions while you're in there. I'm guessing kind of the just small talk or whatever. If they don't know why they're here, or I'm just passing through, and a lot of these other things are showing up, then that's kind of, now that one alone, if someone's like, oh, I just fell, I'm passing through, and it's like a 65-year-old, soccer mom, she probably is just passing through, so don't assume that she's being trafficked. But if that is going on along with a lot of these other ones, it's reason to pay attention. This is a big one. And this is one that you guys can identify because you're in situations where you could see them. Branding. Anyone ever heard of branding? Probably with cows. Okay. Branding is typically one of the first steps that a pimp takes with a new girl is they are branded. All right. Either with an actual brand, like a cow is, or a tattoo. All right. And so in the medical field, we train very heavy on the side of tattoos and branding because you're in the scenarios to maybe encounter and be able to see them. Often they're in visible spots on the body. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they would be in visible places? Right, so that it's easy to identify who they belong to, because the whole point of the branding system and tattoos is to not, we're just going to get tattoos because we love each other, okay, so we're going to get it on our hip, okay? It's somewhere visible so that from a distance I can tell you belong to somebody and who you belong to, okay, which means I can't ask you to work for me, and sometimes means I can't even speak to you, okay? That branding is very common, and it's usually visible. Okay, most of the time it's tattoos because branding is a little more old school, but also a little more severe. Often it's just tattoos. We see that on the regular. And they're not as sneaky tattoos as you would think, okay? We had a girl one time come in and tell us that, she was being trafficked. And I said, we'd always try to get a name. Names are very important. And so, we have our ways of working to get the name. And so I was going all around trying to get the name. And I said, would you mind, telling me, like, his name? And she said, it was literally first, middle, last, the third. Like, right on his arm. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, right. Okay, so it's not a lot of times it's not secretive. Like, sometimes it's like their literal name is tattooed somewhere visible. Okay, or a number, a barcode that comes in all different things, a sign that has to do with their group. We had a girl just recently that had a Louis Vuitton stuff tattooed on her knuckles. Okay, it was because that's all the girls in that group had those on their knuckles. Okay, so it just depends on that group or that pimp. But branding and tattooing is one of the first things that we look for when we're talking to someone. So. The rest of them can't verify a living address. We already talked about that. Unusually fearful or anxious. What that looks like is like a wild animal a lot of times. Like very scared, very anxious, outlandishly, to a point where it's outlandish. Like we've had to have girls restrained in this hospital before because they're so scared. Okay, I'm not talking about the kind of scared that I am in a hospital. I'm talking about very clearly something is wrong. She is too scared, right, for this environment. So that's super important. All right, a few more things, and then I'll let you ask some questions about that. Some more common red flags: flinching or jerking away from contact. If you can't reach out and touch their shoulder, or you're trying to examine them, and there's a lot of just fearful flinching, that's obviously a sign of abuse, so it's important. But it's a big sign of trafficking because they've been traumatized so many times physically, that their body no longer has the ability to hide its fear. Okay, and so there's this. Our girls will do that well into their program. I mean, we have some that you have to like warn them. You're like, I'm coming in for a hug. Everything's fine. Okay, because it takes a long time for them to recover from the physical trauma that they've experienced. And so flinching, an unusual reaction to you doing an exam, like the one woman we had here, the woman who was on Clydfant, they needed to examine her, obviously. And I think at one point there were 7 or 8 nurses, over half of them were men, could not get her legs apart. It was the most insane thing I've ever seen. I literally thought they were going to break them. Like I was like, this is literally, but she was that fearful and that traumatized that her body had the ability to be stronger than made sense. Just to tell you this, she had been pulling against the restraints, right? Like she was restrained, but she was full on pulling against them and never one time stopped for the solid 2 hours that I was with her. This constant just tension, their bodies go into literal panic mode because of the amount of trauma that they've been through. Confused, lack of responsiveness. That woman in particular had been traumatized to a degree through trafficking that she was just chanting over and over again the same phrase. It wasn't English. This was the crazy. There's someone here that speaks Farsi, which we brought in a Spanish speaker. We went through the hospital I was like Google translating it, like holding it up to her mouth. She wasn't speaking a language that we could identify, but she was just, her brain and her body was so traumatized that she was just stuck in a loop. And whatever she was saying, she said for hours and hours and hours, and she was unresponsive. Okay, that's very extreme, and that would be obvious. Like that's an obvious sign that something's wrong. Any questions about those symptoms? Anything? Okay. The next page in your packet is a little more of the behavioral side of symptoms that are not so medical that would present. And those are important to know because as you're in and out with patients, you can pick up on behavioral signs and symptoms as well, right? Like just in your interaction with them. And I'm only going to go over a few of these. So on this page, behavioral signs, a child that has a much older boyfriend, which often happens in the hospital setting because they're the ones who bring them to the hospital. I do not mean 17 and 19, okay, like reserve your judgment, right? I don't mean like, he's too old for her. Okay, I mean like 16 and 35, okay? Something that's illegal, no matter how you look at it. Often the teenage victims that we identify, who they're calling their boyfriend is actually their pimp. Okay, they think it's their boyfriend, and for all purposes, that is their boyfriend. But in all reality, he is their pimp. And so we'll a lot of times be in a conversation with a girl and just be hanging out, drinking coffee, just trying to get to know her. And she'll talk about a boyfriend, and we'll just be like, "Tell us about your boyfriend." And they're all proud, 16 years old, and he's 42, and you're just kind of like. Yeah, like trying to hide, like, what? Right? But it is true. It happens. And a lot of times they believe that that's a boyfriend relationship and not a pimp. Okay? And there's a long brainwashing thing that's happened. References to, and you wouldn't think that people do this, but they do. And we've actually had referrals based off of this one thing. References to the game, the life, the hustle. They'll use slang that they don't think you know. Okay? Especially me. Right? Like, white girl. Like, they think they can use this language in front of me, and I'm like, oh, I know what you said. I'm in the game, too. Not in the game, but, like, I'm around it. But slang words like daddy, the game, the hustle, the life, okay, those are references to prostitution and are very rarely used outside of that. Lingo like wifey. Now, I'm going to pause and say that, like, you can buy tank tops at Target, I think, right now that say wifey on them, which is kind of weird because that's a prostitution term. What a wifey is a girl who has worked her way up to the top for that pimp and is now a recruiter. So if you have that shirt, get rid of it. But wifey, anyone ever heard the term, can I cuss in here? Bottom bitch, anyone ever heard of that? Okay, that's 100% a prostitution term. So a lot of times, if they're just talking and telling you about their life and you hear the word bottom, okay, lingo is important, okay? It's important to listen for. It's important to be knowledgeable about, because they may be saying something and they don't think that you know what it is, but you do. Okay, so that's in here. A child that has access to extreme material possessions. And what that means is maybe that child has been in before and you have some way of knowing, and sometimes you don't know, but they're coming out of extreme poverty, yet their nails are always done. They have the latest iPhone. Where the life situation and the possessions don't add up, okay? A pimp or someone who's recruiting them, especially if they're being recruited, who doesn't want all that, right? I mean, who doesn't want a new iPhone and all their nails done and their hair done and all that kind of stuff? And so the recruitment process often puts things in the hands of kids that they have no access to besides through that person. Okay, so material possessions, I'm talking about like really outlandish, like things that you're like, that doesn't make sense that they have. And what we'll do is we'll just ask them, like, who got you that phone? Right? Like, who got you that? Like, that's a nicer phone than any of us have. Like, how did you get that? Or how are your nails always done? I asked a girl that yesterday. Like, you never have anything to eat and you're wasting away, but like your nails, man, they're on point, right? Like, how? Like, I don't understand. Turns out she's like, oh, my boyfriend does it for me, right? And so you can start to kind of get through to them if you know what to ask. Social media red flags, you would never see those, okay? So sexual photos, references in their status. We have girls that are literally like, come pick me up, I'll do this for you on Facebook. Facebook should be burned to the ground. You hear me? Where are we? Hey, Conway. Haven't said hi yet. Highly sexual with adults or it's delayed. They're like editing what I say. It's like a 30-second delay, like MTV Music Award. Okay. If the child, especially, is highly sexual in nature towards you, okay? Now, what that means is seems like they have the inability to turn it off, okay? That is very common, and that is one of the most heartbreaking things to ever experience. A lot of times when we go into a hotel room, they have been a part of that industry for so long that anyone that they encounter in their mind is just another person that they can, lure in or seduce. And so often, even female to female, often, the first minutes of that encounter are very, very tragic and over-sexual, right? A lot of sexualized behavior towards adults. That is a very bad red flag, because that means that child has either been involved in prostitution or has been sexualized to a point where they have the inability to turn it off when it comes to environments that's not appropriate. And then the last one, behaviorally, is just addicted, highly addicted. Adult or children. I mean, you deal with a lot of adults with addictions here, and I realize that. But if a teenager or a child is highly addicted to something, that is a very bad thing. First of all, that needs to be reported no matter what. But you know now why that can be happening. And so those are like a handful of hundreds and hundreds that you can find, honestly, online of symptoms. And I think you got a packet with an assessment. Kind of shows you kind of how to ask questions, what questions to ask. There's a lot more of that on the website that's listed there. I would just suggest that you kind of become your own expert in this. And you may never encounter it. Here's the thing. You may never encounter it, but what if you do? What if you do? Then, just like that woman the first time that we rescued someone out of this system, out of this hospital, she did. It presented in front of her, and now she became a part of someone's actual rescue, right? And so I would just suggest that you learn. I mean, I know you guys are in med school, and so you're like, I don't need another thing. But it's important, because especially in the setting of this hospital, I guarantee you in your time here, you will see it or have seen it if you've been here for a while. So the last thing we're going to talk about is your plan of action, because that's the most important part. Now, I was talking to them earlier that this is going to be different. Your plan of action is going to be different depending on where you are. If you're in med school or if you're I don't know how all that works with HIPAA and all of that. So I'm just going to kind of tell you what we generally say, but what we say is just go to your direct supervisor or whatever unit that you're in and say, okay, I went to this training, what do we do? That way you know what your specific action is and you don't feel like you're stepping over the line. So it's time to take action. Let's just pretend that something is presenting in front of you and you're like, this all signs are pointing to yes. The number one thing we tell people to do is do not panic, okay? Ever heard knowledge is power? Yeah? Okay, you know it now. You can know more if you want it. Don't panic. How you react in front of a victim will dictate their comfort level from that point out. Okay, so if they say something, this happened to us one time where a girl said, my pimp picked me up from school yesterday, and the teacher was like, okay, I gotta go. Like, she almost passed out. And so the girl literally was when we got there, was like she was scared to say something because of the reaction that she got, because it kind of confirms, man, this must be really bad. Okay, so you can fake it till you make it. Just be like, okay, yes. Some of the things that I hear on a daily basis, I'm just like, all right, girl, I'm going to go investigate that and I'll get back to you, right? You don't have to panic, all right? You guys know that because you're in med school. You know how to hold your cool. So there's some common misconceptions about reporting that I just want to go ahead and dispel. Because raise your hand if you're kind of terrified to report it. Let's just be honest. He's like, okay. Yeah, that is very common, and if there were more honesty in the room, more people would probably say. It's very scary to think about reporting a victim of trafficking. Okay, so I'm going to kind of dispel some myths for you to maybe free you up, sir. What's your name? Damien? Thank you, Damien. All right, the number one misconception is if I report, the pimp's coming after me. All right? That's not going to happen. All right, that is what we think because we watch too much television. Okay, we watch TV shows. I have this really illogical fear when I go on a run that I'm going to see someone murder someone and then I'm now the person that they've got to get rid of because I've seen it. Okay, we all have these illogical fears because of television, because that is how we are entertained, right, is by the dramatic. When it comes to reporting a victim of trafficking, the pimp is not ever going to, one, know it was you, but two, come after you. It's not like she's going to go back to him and be like, Nurse Damien, are you a nurse? Not a nurse. That's offensive. Okay, Damien, I told him, so he may have reported it. That pimp is not going to come into LSU Hospital and be like, can I speak to Damien, please? Okay, it's not going to happen. But because we think, okay, she's told me, so now if I tell someone I'm now the primary target of that pimp, it's not going to happen. Okay, I can pretty much 100% tell you it's not going to happen. One, because it's not happening to us. And we're a lot closer to the situation than you are. And two, it doesn't happen even to law enforcement. Okay, that is a TV kind of mentality of what these pimps are capable of too. Because a lot of times we think they've got a lair with screens and trackers and all this stuff, and really they just live in a crack house. I mean, they don't even have they have a flip phone most of the time. Okay, so we give them a lot more credit than is what's actually happening. Okay, so that is not a reality, but what can happen is it can keep you from reporting because you're like, well, I don't want to get thrown into that, right? I don't want to be the next victim. Okay, so I just want to dispel that. The next one, the victim will retaliate against me. And what that basically, a lot of times people think is they're going to say, oh, well, I told you, so I'm going to go tell everyone that I told you, and I'm going to make them silence you. Okay, that's also very, very dramatic and very TV driven. The cops will use my name and information. Okay, they can't. So that frees you up at all. They're not going to be cuffing the person like, oh, yeah, well, you better thank Damien. He's the reason. He's the reason. He was terrified, but he reported it. Okay. I'll be in trouble at work, or I may lose my job or cross the line in my job. And that is a legitimate reason to not report if you feel like I don't know what I can and cannot do, especially with HIPAA and all the things in place. And so why we do this training is, one, we've trained supervisors and case management. We're trying to build a structure through which you wouldn't feel that way. Okay, so all you have to do to be confident about what is and is not okay within your job is go ask. Say, hey, I've learned this stuff. So as my supervisor, what do I do? Okay, when we trained the nursing staff in the ER, we said call your supervisor, call case management. Everyone has a different role to play, so just figure out what yours is and know I can do this and I can't do that. Then you're not paralyzed because you don't know what you can do. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so just get it approved. That's basically what we say. Another reason people don't report, and this is probably the number one reason, it's probably not what it seems. It can't be as bad as they're making it sound, or it could never be true. I'm just overreacting. Can you imagine that your mind would go there? Because some of the stories I just told you literally do not sound true. They don't even sound true to me as I'm living them. And so a lot of times you'll find people down the road, like I'll do a training and someone will come up to me after and be like, this happened. Like she was in my office, but I just thought, surely not. Surely not. Surely it's not that bad. I don't want to report it and it not be true. Okay, and that's the last one. What we tell people is the worst thing you've done if you've reported it and it isn't true is you've wasted somebody's time. But that's not the worst thing. What you've shown to that girl, if you've reported it and moved on her behalf, and let's say it wasn't true that time, but let's say it really does become true, then she knows I can report it because someone's going to do something. So if you called FBI or called us and said you thought something was going on and it wasn't, we would thank you at the end of it for calling us. It's not a bad thing if it ends up not being true. When it's bad is when it's passed through your hands or through your department and fallen through the cracks because you had convinced yourself that you were being hysterical, right? Or that it wasn't as bad as it seems. So those are some of the misconceptions. So your plan of action is, one, have open eyes and be aware. And we tell people this in hospital settings and in the medical field all the time. You see so many patients and you deal with so many crazy things that sometimes I think you can get lulled a little bit into this is just the mundane of my life, right? Like it's another case or another thing, and sometimes you can become less aware of the things that are presenting. And so we just encourage you to stay sharp, to know what you're looking for and always try to check back into the situation so that you don't miss it. And know the red flags. Ask good questions. That's another part of your action step. Ask good questions because those questions can then kind of bring up some answers that point to some of these things. And there's a whole packet of questions in there. Know red flags and symptoms. And then last thing is make the call. Okay, this is where the freeing part of this is you really only have one responsibility besides recognizing it. And it's to make one phone call. So here's the cool thing. A lot of times we think, if I report it, then I've got to go to court and follow it all the way through. Okay. You will make one phone call and pass that into the hands of the people who will take it all the way to the finish line. Okay. Your lane is not my lane. Okay. My lane is not FBI's lane. Okay. We all have our own role to play. And so if you'll just do your part, it passes it to a person who's going to take the ball a little further and then pass it to someone else so that that person can be freed from that situation. All right, so you're not going to be the person taking her all the way to the end and getting her out, but your role is vital. Okay, so if you're making the call first, like let's say, case manager like, sure, make the call, which I don't even know how that works around here, but we've listed some phone numbers in this packet, and if you picked up a card, did everyone get a little card with oh, she's got them. If you want, that's our hotline card. You can give those out to any girl, anyone. We use that. We have 3 hotlines in the city that we use, so you can give that out. There's some numbers here. If you call the Office of Sex Crimes Against Juveniles, their first call is us. If you call us first, our first call is that FBI agent. Okay, so no matter who you feel comfortable calling first, both people get involved from the very beginning. Okay, so once you know what your role is, if case management calls or whatever, if you have to go to case management and they have to make the call, then your only role is you going to them and saying, here's what I've seen, here's the evidence, can you make the call? Okay, that way you've still done your part. So everything's listed right there, both hotlines, adult and juvenile. You can use that number for either. You don't have to call the adult line to get to someone who can help you. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I used to be a police officer. My question is your only role here to shelter these girls to safety? And why wasn't this guy identified and arrested? If not only for assault and battery, which she doesn't have to make a complaint, it's a witness thing presented to the
right.
bar. Are they involved at all?
Yeah.
Or are they
so
gone and this happens down the road? Or
we Purchase, we're the only agency in North Louisiana that works with this particular topic. And we are very tightly tied to the FBI task force here. And so typically what happens is our lane, I guess, is that woman or that child and making sure that she's taken care of. But another part of what we do is we want to gather the information necessary for law enforcement to do their part, which is to arrest and prosecute. And so anytime we're involved with a referral, both of those things are going on immediately. And so what we'll do is, we'll come in, we'll start getting to know the girl, getting some information. It depends on the situation. But immediately, that information is passed to our agent, on the task force, and immediately we both start working that case from both angles. Just this last year, Purchase was able to help prosecute 3 pimps in our city. So it's not, obviously we're not doing 20, 30 a month, but the end goal for both parts of the task force is for that woman to be rescued, but then also for that man or whoever's doing it to not be able to do it to someone else. And so we are constantly...
That's the real issue. You can save one by sequestering her.
That's right. That's exactly right.
You can save 10 or 50 or 100.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're a very big source of information for law enforcement. And so that's the big, honestly, the biggest part of my job. I have a staff that does a lot of the other stuff. The biggest part of my job is as a liaison between law enforcement and the victim. And so we have a very cool system of passing information. But that's a great question.
What actually happens? So you get a call from the ER, whoever, you think you've got a victim, and you knew that one girl that had run away or whatever. What's the process of getting them out of the hospital? We got somebody who shows up on the labor unit, and we think, there's a problem here, and where does she go?
So our commitment is always to figure that out. We never, unless she doesn't want to go somewhere. But if the child or the adult is a victim of trafficking, or actually for adults, they don't even have to be a victim of trafficking. They could just be in the sex industry or prostitution. We will commit to figure that part out. So typically what happens is we have to assess the situation. We have to kind of do a risk assessment, like do they have a pimp? If they do, where are they? We try to figure out a lot of the information. And then from what we know, if we don't have, a lot of times we'll take them immediately from here, which is what we did yesterday, from discharge to our home, if we have a spot. If we don't, like if we're full, which happens sometimes, we will call a partnering agency and say, hey, here's the situation, here's her situation. Can we put her there today until Monday, and then on Monday, sometimes we have to piece it together if we're full. If they have a pimp and it's kind of a high-risk situation, we have partners outside of the city that we will call to and say, hey, we're bringing you a girl, like we have one in Manny, we have one in New Orleans, to get them out of the city long enough for us to figure out kind of what we need to do. So anyone who is a victim, with the children it's different. With children, immediately CPS is called and involved, and then from there we have has a partnership with DCFS, the foster care system, and we have trauma homes for victims of trafficking. So let's say a child is here and is identified as a victim, we actually still show up. DCFS places them into foster care, but into one of our homes. Does that make sense? So that home has been trained, and then that child enters a program just like our adults do. So now, sometimes they don't want help. Sometimes they don't want out. That happened last week here, too. We visited someone in the psychiatric unit. They didn't want out or didn't want help. We will always come. We will always talk, follow through with them. But sometimes they leave and they don't want out. Does that make sense? So if they're a victim, if they're a child, we will get them out immediately, regardless of whether they want to or not. If they're an adult and they want out, we will get them out that day. It just may take we've had the hospital one time, we needed another day, and so they've booked them like at the hotel, but kept them in that bed for another day to buy us some time. So we will never, if that person wants out, we will never let them walk out the front doors without a plan. Any other questions? Okay, I'll be down here if you have any questions you want to ask privately. Weird. Don't judge people who come and talk to me. But I'll be here if you have any questions. If not, thanks for having me.